Hi everybody, Barbara Manconi Smith here today again. Today, I wanted to continue to talk about the 5 things like I've been doing in the past few days. But for those of you who know me and know a little bit of my story, you know that I am sensitive to mold, and because of that, we have moved several homes, especially in the past year and a half. So it turns out that eventually we moved into a new home, a brand new home, because the chances of having mold in a brand new home were slimmer. So we thought. And sure enough, I just got noticed that we do have home in this brand new home. Sorry, we do have mold in the brand new home. And I was getting some of the symptoms that usually I know are connected. You know, there are my neurological symptoms that resurfaces here and there if I'm exposed. And I was talking to my husband about this is not right. So my husband thought maybe you're stressed. Anyway, sure enough, we do have mold in the brand new home. So today I really wanted to come and talk about mold toxicity because it's timely, not just because it's what I'm going through, but because I know that a lot of you are going through possible mold exposure, environmental toxicity. So I'm going to disclose to you guys today some things that are not really very much talked about. We're going to talk about a little bit of what Anthony William talked about in terms of mold. What are the triggers? What can you do about it? What are some of the foods that he suggests? But we're also going to talk about some of the tests because, you know, I always like to be very efficient and independent. So I want you to be able to test things on your own and already give yourself some answers to see if what you're experiencing could be possible mold toxicity. So if you're coming in, please say hi and tell us where you're watching from. It's always good to know new people. And if I know you, of course, my loyal followers, it's always good to know that you're on the other side watching. And of course, please write your questions as I speak. I will check the comments and I will address them. So today I wanted to talk. The plan was to talk about the 5 things like I've been talking the past few days, but because I just found mold again in the brand new home, we're going to be talking about mold toxicity and what can you do if you find yourself in my situation, or if you think that you may be experiencing symptoms that could be related to mold toxicity. Also, we're going to be talking about who is more likely to be affected by mold and why also not everybody is affected by mold the same way. Also, not all mold is created equal, so we should not be afraid of all mold. But there's some mold that you need to be more afraid than others. And again, I use the word afraid, but as you guys know, I don't like the idea of living in fear. But there are some molds that are more concerning than other. Hi, Connie, good to see you. Hi from Chicago. So let's start diving into the mold conundrum here. Now, mold, the bad mold, as I said, mold is not all created equal. And the mold that you can find on a strawberry or on a piece of cheese is not the same mold that you can find in your attic or in your basement. So that has to be differentiated, okay? Now, not to say that I would want to eat a moldy strawberry, but it's definitely not the same and it's not going to have the same effect in your life and in your health. Also, where the mold is going to end up in your body also plays a huge role. That's something that traditionally doctors and functional medicine doctors don't really pay attention to, but the location of the mold in your body, it's actually key, and it's important to understand what we're dealing with and why, where the mold could be, so that we know how to possibly detoxify from it. So now, if you come in contact with the bad mold, now everybody knows about the black mold, of course. There's some other types of mold that are also not really health-inducing, although not as pervasive as the black mold. So when we're talking about the nasty mold, right? There's no sugar coating about it. It's not a good thing. And I've had a lot of you coming with symptoms, neurological symptoms, mostly due to mold exposure and mold toxicity. Now, I don't think there is aware that mold is as bad as it actually is, but I want, also because it's almost my own private battle, I want to raise that awareness about mold toxicity and how bad that is, because you guys, make no mistake, mold is a decomposer. So that means that mold the main mission of the mold is to decompose the host, or where is attacking. Different than viruses that needs us to be alive, they need the host to be alive to sustain themselves, to exist and live. Mold doesn't need us to be alive. The main goal of mold is to decompose you. So if we do experience mold, now it's not always mold, and so we have to, that's why we're going to go through some kind of elimination tactics to figure out whether what you're experiencing is really mold or something else. But if it is mold, and if you've been affected by mold, then mold all of a sudden goes up on top of the list of things that you want to detoxify from, even before metals, absolutely before viruses, because as I said, once mold is in you and is affecting you, it might not affect everybody the same way. So you may be affected, your husband is not, and I will bring you examples of my clients who were exactly in that situation. But once mold is inside of you, the black mold, the bad mold, the nasty mold, mold has the one goal only, which is to decompose. And so it's not going to feel pretty, and unless we're able to eliminate the mold, we're not going to feel better. Now, Anthony talks about the fact that mold is a trigger and triggers other pathogens within the body, namely, of course, the viruses and the bacteria that he often talks about. But today we're just going to focus on mold, and we're going to focus on, do we have mold? What kind of mold? How do we know if we have mold? How do I know if I'm sensitive to mold? How do I know if what I'm experiencing is connected to mold? And last but not least, what can we do about it? Okay, so as you come in, please say hi. And I'm, as I said, I'm talking about mold today because I just found out that we have mold in our brand new home that we moved to, because we thought, hey, in this area, we're by the beach. It's really hard not to find mold in homes because of the, humidity. But a brand new home, we really thought that this was not going to happen. But yes, it is happening. And we're having remediation people coming into the house tomorrow. So needless to say, we'll have to move out. Now, I'm so relaxed because this is possibly my 5th time that I have been dealing with this. And I'm just taking things as they come, almost, laugh about it because, what is the alternative, right? So let's talk about Anthony William and what a medical mutant tells us about mold. So Anthony, if you guys had the chance to listen to his latest podcast about mold, he really stresses the importance of understanding the distinction between the mold that we are currently experiencing right now in modern times versus the mold that used to be. Mold is part of the fungi family. So, and it's on a broader sense, it's part of the environmental toxins that Anthony talks about as well. But what Anthony gives us as a background and as a perspective from his insights is that the mold that we're experiencing right now is not the same mold that our grandparents or people a couple of hundred years ago were experiencing. Why? Because as I said, it's a fungi, it's part of the fungi family, and as we have seen happening with bacteria, and I should say recently, but I'm not going to go there, but recently with circulating viruses, they can escape the remedy, so to speak. In that case would be antibiotics, in this case could be vaccine, in the case of mold could be fungicide. They could escape it and become resistant to the agent that was created to actually fight it. So we see this because, again, these little suckers, whether we're talking about viruses, bacteria, or fungi, yeast, and whatnot, they have their own will to live. And so in order to live, they have to get stronger than what we throw at them to destroy them. So Anthony attributes the fact that the mold that we're dealing with right now in this modern days is the result of basically a mold on steroids, is the result of the resistance that the mold has been able to develop to fungicides, so that it got stronger and stronger and is able to evade the traditional fungicide or the traditional agents that are used. And Anthony talks about mass production, meaning he's not talking about the one that you spray in your shower if you see a little bit of mildew. He's talking about stuff that is sprayed on us from the sky, namely helicopters. They are spraying fungicide. And he also mentioned the fact that the same helicopters are spraying fungicides is because before that they were spraying like some mosquito repellent type of agent. So and because these mosquito repellents are known to be growing mold, then they have to then spray some fungicide. And again, he talks about it as a kind of a widespread thing, kind of a known thing or unknown thing, but that is happening on a wide scale. So that these fungicides are actually falling into the homes into the roofs of the homes where people live, and they're supposed to then take care of the mold, the forms. However, because they're getting stronger and stronger and are able to evade and escape the fungicides, then we have this kind of mold on steroids. Like we have bacteria on steroids, they are evading antibiotics, and now we have very strong strains of viruses, right? They are circulating because they're able to even evade the vaccine. So this is a known factor that happens, but it's interesting how Anthony brings this into the mold conversation, letting us know that the mold we're dealing with is not the mold that our grandparents were dealing with. And in fact, because I've been dealing with mold a lot, I was not surprised to see mold growing into my toilet. So now mold, if you talk to mold experts, they will tell you that mold only grows in pores, on porous surfaces, like of course wood, for instance, or some type of fabrics, right? But you wouldn't expect to see mold on porcelain, right? The porcelain of your toilet. And yet, I promise you guys, and not in this house, the house two houses ago, the mold was growing into my toilet. Have you ever seen mold growing into your toilet? And if you haven't, I urge you to go check out your toilet and go underneath in the rim and see if you see any mold growing there. The reason why, it's because this mold, it's becoming so resistant, and it's basically adapt to grow everywhere. As I said, it doesn't just grow on food, it doesn't grow just on wooden, the damp wooden places or grass or trees. Actually, it really grows everywhere. So the need of spray fungicide everywhere, from our carpets to our couches to our clothes, everything is sprayed with fungicide. And of course, needless to say that fungicides are not good for us, and way less the mold that is then created, the mold on steroids that evades the fungicide and is still kind of resistant. And so we're supposed to both fungicides on one end, and then the mold that is stronger, stronger type, so to speak, of mold, right? So that is kind of Anthony's perspective on the mold, and the fact, the insights that the mold we're dealing with, it's not the same kind of mold that we used to deal with. The fact that the mold that we're dealing with, it's now growing on toxic substances, that it's able to grow on chemicals, for instance, that is feeding off of EMF as well. So, I mean, these are all toxicity that chemicals and EMF and 5Gs that didn't used to be here, a couple of hundred years ago. And so the kind of mold that now grows resistant, or despite, the fact that the presence of chemicals and EMF, it's a different kind of mold. Hence, this type of mold is going to affect us and our body in a different way, not the same way the old type of mold used to affect us. Okay, Anthony also makes the example of the fact that the mold that is able to grow today could actually survive in a gas tank if the gas stayed long enough in the tank. And basically it's saying that nobody could survive in a gas tank, and mold can. Just to tell you how aggressive and resistant this type of strains of molds that we're dealing with right now are. Now, what I wanted though to bring the attention to you guys today is that not everybody is affected the same way. Some people are not affected at all, despite the very heavy strain of mold there being growing progressively resistant, right? So despite all of it, not all of us react the same way. The example I just recently had in my autoimmunity program, a lady who had severe neurological issues, and she realized that most of her issues were when she was in the house. When she was not in the house, like she was at the beach, she lives in Hawaii, she was at the beach, or she was, visiting family and friends, she did not have the same issues as much as what she had when she came back home. So she was convinced that something was connected to her home, although mold was not visible. On the same time, husband and the 3-4-year-old son were totally not affected. Now, eventually, they end up getting a test, and they do find mold in her kitchen. And so she is now just settling down into a new home, but she had to move from one Airbnb to another Airbnb, and even hotels, and making sure that she had, she would request a room for people that are extremely sensitive and have allergies, because her symptoms were severe and they were getting worse and worse, because of course she had a constant exposure until they really figured out that mold was triggering these issues. So the question is, why is it that not everybody gets affected the same way? Well, as I always say, for everything, the same is with the viruses, right? With the EBV, we all have it, but why is it that we don't all get affected the same way? So because something is happening in the body of my client, for instance, that is happening or not happening versus the husband. So what is happening there, and why is she more prone to be definitely affected, almost bedridden by mold, where her husband can absolutely live in the kitchen and the son as well and not being affected at all? So who is more at risk? Now, there are some things that are genetics, you guys, and although genetics really it's just a little part of most of the things that happen to us, because we do need epigenetics to turn on those genes. I did some studies that show, I read some studies that show that some people are genetically predisposed to grow mold inside. So for instance, if I breed mold and you breed mold, the mold can go just through you. Now remember where I'm coming from, and if you ever heard anything I said before, I'm the lady that talks about elimination as kind of the key of life and health. So if the husband of my client, he was absolutely breeding the mold, and so was the son. So the problem is that with them, not the problem, but the solution was with them, the mold was coming in and was going out. With her, the mold stayed inside and he grew inside and was able to multiply, and then the body had to deal with it. But this didn't happen with the son. And so ultimately, this is what we're going to be talking about. But for right now, let's talk about who is more prone. So anybody who is dealing with neurological issues, as most often, I would say 99% of the time, as a result of heavy metal damage, it's more prone to be susceptible or drastically susceptible to mold. Why? Because, and you guys, if you are relating to what I'm saying, and if it makes sense, and if you feel like that what I'm saying makes sense to you, please just say, yes, Barbara, this is happening to me. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer them, okay? So, but who is more prone to being affected by mold? Anybody with neurological issues as a direct effect of heavy metal damage. Why? Heavy metals are a very toxic substance, right? You understand that. So the body, once exposed to it, the body tries to protect us in many ways, because the body's always, remember, plan B, C, D, what can I do, right? To deal with it. Now, it tries to protect us and store the metals away from the organs, so it does it in the bones, it does it in the fat, it does it in the brain. Why? Because, toxins, specifically metals, but all toxins are corrosive, are acids. From a chemical perspective, toxins are acidic, not alkaline. So anything that is corrosive will be too damaging for the body. So the body is able to, tame the issue by storing the toxins. In this case, we're talking about heavy metals, in lipids, in fat, because the lipids are the only thing that can coat them and make the metals less reactive. Does it make sense? Okay, so where do we have this fat? This fat that can coat the metals and make them less reactive. Well, one part is where we store a lot of our toxins is in your visceral fat in the belly area, right? But the other part is the fat in your brain, and that is the main issue. So what happens is when we have exposure to metals and the body is not able to eliminate. Because remember, guys, everything then trickles down to elimination. Meaning, if you guys have had vaccine, right, in your life, even recently, not everybody responds the same way. Not everybody becomes autistic after you get inoculated, right? Why? Yet we're exposed to the same substances, and yet we don't all react the same way. Well, the main answer is, and the ultimate answer is, that for the person who doesn't get reaction is because the body is able to effectively eliminate the substances. For those who in fact get affected in different ways, whether it's the current vaccine or previous vaccines, the body in fact is not able to, and so has to put in place plan B, C, and D to try to figure out how we're going to disperse this toxicity so that it doesn't harm us as much. So in the case of heavy metals that we're talking about, the body is trying to eliminate or coat them to make them less reactive, and when it does put them into the brain, into the fat in the brain, what happens is that the metals bypass the brain-blood barrier. And I often do the correlation between the brain-blood barrier and the gut. You guys probably have heard the leaky gut, right? Or the intestinal permeability. And maybe if you ever heard of it, or if you watch videos or even documentary, what you see, it's basically like a net that when we're talking about gut permeability, that when it becomes permeable, it kind of loosens it up, the fibers, and so the holes in between becomes like bigger, so that allow permeability in a place where there should not be permeability, right? So when you experience gut permeability, stuff that is not supposed to be on the other side, like the blood, for instance, instead now all of a sudden you have stuff that you've been eating that is going through, and so the body then will have an immune response to it because it perceives them as foreign. They're not supposed to be there. So the similar things happen when metals pass the brain-blood barrier. So something that is not supposed to be there because there's a barrier, this barrier all of a sudden loosens it up, and metals are able to go through. And then the body stores, try to coat them in the fat that we have in the brain. The problem is that when the metals do that, are able to open up, past the brain-blood barrier, we can say they live behind the trace, meaning it doesn't close back right away, it stays open. So you already have the first sign, or one of the first signs of metal damage. And this brain-blood barrier opening, it's what is creating then the possibility for mold, if you are exposed to it, to pass through the barrier as well, that is being opened up by the damage left behind by the vaccine. Freud is with me today. Has been left behind by the metals. So who is more prone to be affected by mold? Those of you who are experiencing metal damages, heavy metal damages. Those of you who are storing metals in the brain and in the fat part of the brain, and hence you're experiencing a lot of neurological issues that are direct response of metal damages. If you then, in this situation, are exposed to mold, then you're doubling down on the damage, because now you got mold into the brain, and that is the real problem. That is also why when we talk about what are the symptoms of mold toxicity, they are very similar to the ones of heavy metal toxicity and any neurological issues. Why? Because they're both there. They're both in the brain and they're both oxidizing, but more than the metals, as I said at the beginning, the mold is a decomposer. The mold works from within to destroy you. That's not what the metals do. And in fact, metals don't even have like an innate intelligence like the microorganisms that we're discussing, right? So those are fighters, and those, they want to stay alive, and those are, in the case of mold and the fungi, there to decompose the host. So although metals are what cause or open up the ability for mold to pass through, once the mold is in your brain, as I said at the beginning, the very first thing you want to get rid of is that mold, because again, The mold is a decomposer. Now, having heavy metals in the brain is not a good thing, but even Anthony talks about fillings in your mouth, leave it there until they're broken and don't touch them. So you don't want to stir the metals until other things are happening. In my book is until your elimination pathways are open so that you know that you are actually eliminating them. But in the case of mold, you really want to drop almost everything you're doing, take care of the mold, because the mold will decompose you and the mold will make you feel really, really sick. Does it make sense? And you guys, please just let me know if that is clear, or if I have to make it more clear in other ways. So if you have been damaged by metals, and if you are experiencing neurological issues, there could be, and it's warranted, I will say, the fact that you will ask yourself, could what I'm experiencing be due to mold exposure as well? Meaning, not that the metals weren't doing the damage, but maybe you could feel worse and you may think that you have a flare or things coming up, and that could be due to mold. And if it is important, for me is the utmost importance that you figure it out if mold is an issue for you, meaning if you are exposed to mold, if there's mold in your house, if there's a mold in the environment that you're working with or you're spending the most time, because if that's the case, then you know that possibly you're more susceptible. And so things in your health journey will have to happen. At least, for the people who work with me, we're going to assess the risk, especially in a lot of the people that I see with whom I do autoimmunity recovery program. We look at, of course, as one of the possible triggers to autoimmunity and mold. Why? Because once mold is inside of your body, it lowers your immune system. So in the case of autoimmunity, of course, when we already have a disproportionate immune response, we have to look at what are all the possible triggers that could make the immune system kind of go haywire. Now, if you pair that up with a possible metal toxicity and then a possible metal exposure, then it's a perfect cocktail for what could lead to, of course, autoimmunity, right? So what can we do? If you're experiencing neurological issues, and by neurological issues, I mean, it could be anything. Could be, of course, headaches, brain fog, trouble concentrating, trouble finding words, memory issues, but also we're talking about joint pains, headaches, like to the point of migraines, cough, rashes, of course, compromised immunity, asthma, shortness of breath, congestion, bloody nose, irritated eyes, diarrhea, constipation, heartburn. So if you're experiencing any of this, and you're suspecting, and if you even notice that that's kind of conditional to where you find yourself, like my client, she noticed that the symptoms were worse when she was back in her house, specifically her kitchen. When she was outside of the house, even for a few hours, the symptoms were milder. So if you are feeling something like this, the first thing that you need to do is to figure out if indeed you're exposed to mold. So is it in your house? Of course, the first thing you want to do is to go and look around if you can visibly see sign of dampness. And of course, you go first in the most obvious places, wherever there's water, right? So your kitchen, underneath your sink, in the bathroom, underneath the sink, the shower, the bathtub, so wherever the water runs. But then, of course, it can also be elsewhere. It can also be from the person that lives above you. So maybe they have a leak and you don't know. Other times, again, mold seeps through the walls, so you don't have to see the mold to actually have mold present in your home. Like in this current case, we live by the beach, so it's very moist all the time. So we have fan that automatically comes on in the bathrooms, for instance, and that shows us that it's constantly humid and moist. So we haven't seen so far any mold in the bathrooms, but I know that the fan's going on. It's because the environment, it's moist, regardless from the fact that someone just took a shower. You know what I'm saying? So you want to look at first of all, to anything that can be visible. Then if you don't see any, of course, if you see sign, a stain of water, that is the first place you start. But then if you don't see anything, of course, it could be in the air. So one quick trick that you can see, that you can check, is to leave some of the fruit that you eat on a daily basis on the counter and see if within 1 or 2 days they get moldy. Now, fruit should not get moldy right away. Of course, it will get moldy if you leave it 10 days, 2 weeks out on the counter. But in 2 days, fruit should not be getting moldy. And I'm talking about you guys leaving it out in, of course, don't leave them out in the sun, fermenting or whatnot. But I'm just saying if you just leave it somewhere in the, on the counter, and if your fruit gets moldy in a couple of days, that could be a sign that in the air there are spores coming from somewhere that are then attaching to the fruit. Now, fruit eventually will grow mold. Why? Because the mold, as we said, is a decomposer, and once the fruit is on its way out, the mold will come up to decompose. But I don't know if you guys, or if I ever told you about this trick, which is to have a piece of bread, some cheese, and some fruit on the counter. And out of the three, see which one is going to grow mold faster. So the bread, especially the white bread, will grow the mold faster. Then it will be the cheese, and very last will be the fruit. Why? Because mold the fungi are in the fermentation business. They come in when things are already rotting and then they will further the decomposition process. Fruit per se is not fermented, at least when it's whole, right? So again, finding fruit after a couple of days on your counter with mold, it's not indicative that the fruit was really bad, unless, you already buy the fruit moldy, but it's more indicative that in the air you may have spores, and that is what's happening. So if you have anything wooden that gets wet all the time, maybe it's your wooden brush in the shower, maybe you have a stool in the shower that is wooden, go and check this areas to see if you see mold. If you see mold growing in the grout, between your tiles in your bathroom, of course, check your basement, check your attic, check when it rains, after it rains, see if you notice any stain. Because even though with time they could dry up, the mold had the chance to grow. What Anthony says is that actually when they dump the fungicides on our roofs, and then the mold gets stronger, anytime it rains, it can seep through the roof, through the walls, through the cracks, through the window, and so then eventually you have it in your house. So the first thing to do is, as I said, you want to check for to see anything visible in your home, or in the place of work, or wherever it is that you spend the most time, okay? Then one thing, and I told you that today we were talking about tests that are not very well known, and people don't really talk about it, but because again, I became a little bit of an expert, unfortunately, on mold, that's what you can do. If you start feeling that you have issues, maybe intuitively you know that could be mold, or maybe you know for a fact that you've been exposed to mold, you can take to measure whether you are being affected by mold or not, what is called visual acuity test. Why? Visual acuity test, of course, measure the visual acuity. Our blood vessels are affected by mold. So the cytokines increase vascular permeability. And when that happens, basically, the blood vessels leak. And when that happens in our retina, there are small blood vessels. And when there's mold toxicity, our ability to perceive black and white lines may be compromised. So let me just repeat this. If we are affected by mold, since mold affects the vessels in our eyes, our ability to perceive black and white line may be compromised. So the visual acuity test is a way to check visual permeability. So to see if we have this issue with the black and white line in our eyes. Now, this test has been used since 1940s, and actually used to be used with the armed forces to see if they were exposed to biotoxins, and mold is one of them. Now, what is important to understand is that this visual acuity test that I'm telling you about doesn't necessarily tell you if it's positive that you are exposed to mold, but it does tell you that you're exposed to a biotoxin and environmental toxin. So most likely it's mold, but it could be other things. But a positive test in your visual acuity test will tell you that something obviously is affecting you. You are being affected by environmental toxicity. I'm gonna put the resources at the bottom of this video so that you guys know. You can actually go online on this website, and there's one free, but the more accurate is the one that you pay $15, and you can do it online. And so it will give you right away an idea in a positive or a negative, so you will know. So for instance, with the people that work with me on the autoimmunity program, reversing program, we do the visual acuity test right away, especially if they are experiencing neurological issues. So another way to test for mold, of course, and not for mold in your environment, that's a separate thing. You need to find an inspector. We can talk about that. But to see if you have mold in your body is to test your urine for mycotoxicity. Now, the problem with that is that, like with everything, especially for instance with metals too, is that if they don't find any mold in your urine, it doesn't mean necessarily that you don't have mold growing inside of you. It may just be meaning that you are not able to eliminate it. So a negative test on your mycotoxins, on your urine mycotoxins, doesn't necessarily exclude the fact that mold may be affecting you. But what it means is that you're not able to eliminate. And then we go back to my main mantra, which is the problem is at the end of everything, including viruses, metals, all of it, mold and whatnot, EMF is, not everybody gets sick the same way. And the bottom line is that it's because our ability to eliminate this toxicity varies from person to person. So you can still do the urine test. I think it's a good shot, especially if you know that you've been exposed to mold, or if you are very sensitive and you are experiencing neurological issues. What I advise my clients is to do when they do mycotoxicity test, the urine mycotoxin test, is to take some glutathione, do some infrared sauna, and maybe work out a little bit so that you bring it to the system, and then it's easier and go pee and do your test. So that's a little trick that you can do if you decide to do a urine test. So it will give a better chance to see if you can maybe push some elimination to see if it actually isn't there. Again, as I said, a negative urine mycotoxin test doesn't necessarily exclude the fact that you might be growing mold. Of course, a positive one, then it's kind of self-explanatory. Another thing that is important to say is that when we have mold exposure, mold can affect our antidiuretic hormone. So the antidiuretic hormone, not a lot of people know, is responsible for regulating the electrolytes in the body. So when the antidiuretic hormones lowers and is affected by mold, basically what happens is you drink, you pee, and despite the amount of water you drink, you feel constantly dehydrated. And the dehydration is manifested by sweating and by having kind of a salty grain on the skin, and that creates almost what we call it a human battery, basically. So it could happen that if you are sweating this salty grain because you're extremely dehydrated, this salt, and you touch a doorknob, you may have an electric shock. So that's, I can go very much in details into this stuff, you guys, because unfortunately, as I said, I study a lot about mold because I was affected by it. Why? Because I, first of all, had metal damage, right? So anyway, I don't want to be too technical, but I just want you to remember these two things. Try to do a visual acuity test, and I will put the resources there for you to do it, either free or $15 on that website. Two, if you're really serious and you really feel that, for instance, you get a positive test on your visual acuity test, then try to do a urine test for mycotoxicity and see if it comes back positive. Now, before you do it, remember, take some glutathione, do some infrared sauna, work out a little bit, and then do the pee and put it in the stick, and you can just send it over. So you don't even have to go to a doctor for that. You can, if you need, you can, contact me and I'll tell you which one to do it on your own. Another sign of mold toxicity could be having an histamine reaction, itchy eyes, cough, shortness of breath, and maybe a different reaction to food that you never had before. So an onset of allergies to food that you didn't have before could also be due to the fact that you've been exposed to mold. So what we said, all of this was referred to what you can do for yourself. Of course, you can absolutely, and maybe you should, like I just did, test your home for toxicity, for mold toxicity. As I said, not all mold is created equal. So if they come to you, if you get an inspector, a mold inspector, and they will test, they will take air samples if there's nothing visible. Otherwise, they will take a physical sample as well of the wall or the stain. They will give you a report and it will tell you exactly what they find. So sometimes the mold that they find, and usually when they do this kind of test, they also test the air outside of your home too, because believe it or not, there's a lot of mold growing outside. So if the levels are, it's normal to find some level of mold, especially if you leave your doors open and windows open. So they have to test what's outside to make sure that what's inside is actually much more. But of course, the black mold is the worst. So the type of the chetomium is really bad. If you find that, I mean, just run for the hills, leave everything behind, just go bathe yourself in the river and just start a new life somewhere else with nothing but new clothes and new stuff. The Stachybotrys, I believe, is another one, really black, bad type of black mold. So one thing that I can do, that I advise people to do, is to buy something that is called Surf Guard. And if you, for instance, like me, living in a kind of a coastal area where, you know, it's by default gets very moisty, always wipe your surfaces with Surf Guard. And the Surf Guard is you can Google it, Surf Guard products. And so you can just wipe your surfaces, including your toilet. Another place you want to check for mold is your washer, your washer, your washing machine. In the rubber part, the water sits in there, sometimes can create mold, and that is actually really bad. You can actually smell it. So make sure that you spray the Safeguard and you clean that regularly as well. So what do we do for mold if we are positive to mold? And again, I want to make sure that you guys do the test, because you guys, I know that you love supplements and you kind of just assume like it's possibly mold, and maybe when I was little I had mold, but I don't want you to take more supplements that is necessary. And so for me, it's really important that you do the test also mentally, to really say, okay, yes, I do have mold. No, you know what, I don't have mold, and maybe what I'm dealing with, it's something completely different. Now, of course, when we have mold, Anthony also tells us, and it's common knowledge, that mold lowers your immune system. So if you, like most of us, have viral load inside and you've been hoarding toxicity, because again, if you have mold, that you become more susceptible, it is a fact that you are not properly eliminating. So my client was definitely detrimentally affected by the mold in their kitchen. Her husband wasn't. Again, they're breathing the same thing. So it's not that someone is not breathing, you know, is breathing more, is breathing less. They're breathing the same thing. The guy is fine, she's not. So ultimately, their ability to eliminate that toxicity is very different. So for her, who was already vaccine damaged and who had different chemical sensitivity already, she was hoarding toxicity, meaning that toxicity is not able to go out. Otherwise, she wouldn't be getting to the point where she got. That's why someone becomes autistic after X amount of vaccines, and someone doesn't. So the person that does is because his or her elimination pathways are not working properly. The same is with the current vaccine, you guys. Not everybody, and I see here Shalini is saying that she's had some issues after the jab, because our ability to eliminate is not the same. So the way I eliminate toxicity is not Shalini's way to eliminate toxicity, right? So it's important that we understand that. And ultimately, it goes back to that. Are we eliminating? Are we able to eliminate productively? And if not, we have to go after our elimination pathways, guys. So watch my video for 2 days ago about the 5 major elimination pathways that you need to check on a daily basis to make sure that they're working properly. Because again, if you're then exposed to mold, your body was designed to get rid of toxicity. But if it's already taxed and overburdened, and you've been already hoarding toxicity for a while, mold is just going to be one thing that you put on top. The problem is, the mold doesn't affect you the same way that a virus does, or the same way that a bacteria does, the same way even the metals does. Now, they're all bad, but viruses feed off of all this toxicity you've been hoarding, you know? Metals open up the brain barrier, blood barrier, and let the mold comes in if you do get exposed. So mold, basically, we need to get it out of our system. But again, what I'm about to tell you I was saying is, please make sure that you do some tests, you find the mold in your house, in your home. First, because you want to eradicate it and possibly move out. Two, because you want to make sure that, what we're going to discuss here is not done superfluously, because you don't need any more supplements, you people. So it's important that if you are severely allergic to mold or being affected by mold, you consider talking to your doctor about NAC or glutathione, but not the one that you take in pills, the one that you inhale, because it's a much different strength and it goes straight to your brain, and that's where you want to go. Craniosacral therapy actually works for mold, and also the dynamic neural retraining system, which is DNRS. I don't know if you guys ever heard of it, but it has been very successful for helping people eliminating mold. So dynamic neural retraining system. Neurofeedback as well. All these things can help downregulate the limbic system, because with mold, there's always an overactivation of the brain. Of course, make sure that you have air purifiers, ideally in every room, but at least in your bedrooms where you spend the majority of the night. And then get on some of the supplements that support the elimination, B, your neurological well-being. So we're talking about lemon balm, ginkgo biloba, spirulina. Anthony recommends spirulina to remove, of course, metals, but also mold. B12, of course, rosemary, that can be taken fresh, but also in an essential oil form and just be diffused in the air. Chinese skullcap and stinging nettle. As I said, the nebulized NAC or glutathione, only under supervision. Make sure that you eat plenty of leafy greens, because they're really good for your brain. So arugula, kale, spinach, radishes, of course, the celery juice, lots of fruit, because you guys, fruit is the glucose reserve that your brain needs to function. So when you have metals and mold, you have this short-circuiting things happening in your brain, and that's symptoms that you feel, right? So you want to make sure that you give your brain as much as glucose as possible, and fruit is where it's at, you guys. Also because of the connection brain gut, if there's something going on in your brain, for sure it's going on in your gut as well, and so you need a lot of fruit to help repair the gut imbalances. So I'm going to post some of the resources I just talked about down here in the comments for you guys, about the mold test, about the visual acuity test that you can do, the Surface Guard USA that you can go and buy to just spray on your surfaces if you think that you're subjected to mold and want to keep your house mold free, so to speak. Again, you don't spray Surface Guard USA on the black mold already there. You need to call a remediation company, and you possibly have to leave the house and not be in there during remediation, but that's another thing. Now, all I've discussed, and I will always discuss it, will always end up at the same place, and not because I like to talk about this all the time, but really this is the bottom of everything. If you're not able to eliminate, if your elimination pathways are not open, it doesn't really matter what you do, because whatever you do is stir even mold in the surface is still not going to go out. That's why the husband of my client is totally fine, because he's peeing that mold out of his system. The wife is not, and that's why she's sick. So it's important that you keep your elimination pathways open. Go watch my video. You'll find them all under announcement that I did 2 days ago. The 5 major elimination pathways, they have to be open. And of course, I will do it. I do it myself all the time and regularly. This is how my family deals with things. My daughter is 80% fruit, and she's basically the best successful case of lymphatic reset. Consider getting on a lymphatic reset if you think you're dealing with mold, because of course what you want is to flush that stuff out, and you want to help your body eliminate as much as possible, right? So it's pivotal, it's imperative that you consider helping your elimination pathways, so that whatever you decide to do, even the NAC, nebulized and glutathione, all the other supplements, still, first of all, they have to be eliminated themselves, but they have, if they pull, even the spirulina, if they pull stuff, they can then effectively eliminate it. Okay, so I hope that this was informative for you guys. I kind of condensed most of the information that I study myself, that I got, that I use, because as I said, I've been victim of mold multiple times. My mom thinks I'm cursed and the mold is just chasing me. But just today I found out that my house, the brand new house that we moved into 5 months ago, due to another moldy house, has mold again in the garage and the bathroom adjacent. So I wanted to come and talk about mold because it's timely for me, but I know that there's a lot of you that are dealing with that, and a lot of people in my private group asked me to talk about, so I'm gonna download this video and post it in that group as well. If any of you want more support with mold, please, you know where to find me, by ManconiSmith.com. And if you are dealing with mold, I hope to see you in our next lymphatic reset starting on August 9th. Again, you find all the information on BarbaraManconiSmith.com. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.